right? This is just right now. So if I just stop in the middle of something, I have to think it through. But as I mentioned in the abstract, this is about context dependence of science. And I listened to some of your presentations. I think that's not something that's new to any one of you, but I thought I'd start by explaining what I mean when I talk about context dependence of science. So in their education, in our education, scientists are commonly taught that science delivers objective knowledge, and the key to objectivity is that the scientists in themselves should be replaceable. It shouldn't matter who conducts the research. The results should be the same in respect of me doing it or someone else. And if that's not the case, that's a clear sign that the study is flawed in one way or another. It could be that the researcher is conducted with a full research, that what they're doing, or they're actually driven by some ulterior motives, like they're bought by the industry or they're eco warriors or something like that. So how do I change slide?
You should be able to hit the arrow or just maybe click on that slide.
Did that.
Oh.
Click. Sorry. So scientists are also taught that scientific knowledge is generalizable. That if it's true in one place, then it's true everywhere, at any time. Scientific knowledge, we are commonly taught, is independent of the context in the sense that it's independent not only of who does the work, but also where and when it's done. A rock will sink in water, whether we threw a rock here, in Sweden, or in Öberg, provided that's not a volcanic rock and that the water temperature is above 0 degrees. So in our publications, we carefully describe how our studies were done, which instruments that we used, what type of samples, the kind of filters, what kind of reactants, I have a chemistry background, and so on. And we report the conditions that might have impacted it, such as temperature. But the scientists would never describe who they were and the reasons for conducting the study. At least not 30 years ago when I did my undergrad. And it was unthinkable to add any comment to that in the manuscript. I don't know what would have happened if I had written, I'm a female from Sweden, growing up in an upper middle class family or something like that. I think my supervisor would have just struck it out. And if he hadn't seen it, either the paper would be rejected or they would have come back and said, strike this out. Because it's irrelevant. Who I am is irrelevant. Somewhere between there and then, I'm not sure when, but journals started requesting funding information because someone became awareness that, well, if it's funded by Bayer, when you do research on chemicals, then it's more likely to be positive than if it's funded by an independent academic who's more likely to find problems, which can be seen as a conflict of interest if you come from the industry. And later on, some journals, I don't think all, but you are required to report conflicts of interest. Interestingly, it's rarely defined what that means. So do you have a conflict of interest? Yes, no, what is that? And which I find a bit peculiar. And I've got pulled into questions about conflicts of interest because I was one of the co-authors on a paper on conflicts of interest in relation to the proposed UN panel on chemicals and waste, and where we point out that interests are not the same thing as conflicts of interest, which made some people not happy. And I'm a member of the Society of Environmental Toxicology and Chemistry, which is an organization that involves both government, academics, and industry. And we're having a special session this summer about inspired by our paper. So I'm right now reading up on conflicts of interest, and it's surprisingly little literature that I've been able to find that deals with expert advice to policy organizations such as the IPCC or this proposed panel. So if anybody has that kind of literature, please let me know, because I need it so I can handle that panel better. That's a bit of a side line, but it's it's tied to this question about science being objective and independent of who is doing the research, where it's done, and whose interest is served. And today it's fairly common practice to report conflicts of interest, whatever that might be. At the university we are required to report it, and there it's quite clear what it means for us as academics to have a conflict of interest in relation to the research we do. But the papers, the journals don't specify what they mean. I digress. In the past decade, so-called positionality statements have become more and more common in some fields. It started in humanities maybe 20 years ago, and it's spreading to the natural and social sciences. Are you familiar with positionality statements? Okay. So positionality statements is something that describes who you are, and it started in fields that deal with diversity, so EDI questions. So if whether you're male or female, whether you're white, or if you're from a country where you're not white, or if you're born in Canada but you're not white, or whatever you are, and your sexuality, if you're dealing with those kind of questions. So in the science, it's been argued that those questions don't matter for science. So it's okay if you study, like fat studies is apparently a large field, I've recently learned. So if you're a researcher in fat studies, it's practice that you talk about your body weight and your body perception, etc. But if I'm an environmental chemist and I study the transportation of certain chemicals, or how have PFAS in the drinking water or not, it doesn't matter if I'm a woman or not, right? Well, there's argument more and more that, well, it actually can matter, because the questions you ask, depending on who you are, impacts how you approach the studies, even though there might be something that seems to be very, very remotely relevant to your gender, for example. The original idea with positionality statements was to get researchers to reflect on their positionality and who they are in different ways, and how it might impact the study. Why I find things interesting and relevant, and why I don't might find other things interesting and not interesting. Does the fact that I'm a white woman in the 60s who was born in Sweden to an upper middle class family, does that impact the questions I ask? Or rather, how does that impact the questions I ask and the things I find interesting? And maybe more important, the things I don't find interesting to study. And a central piece in the development of positionality statements is for researchers to recognize that they're working in a structure where power and privilege has a huge impact on what gets done and what doesn't get done. And there is a so-called wheel of power and privilege. I don't know, have you seen this one? It comes in different versions. I think it's been in one of the previous talks. I see people nodding. So then you're familiar with that people in the center are more privileged, people in the outer part are more marginalized, people in the middle circle are sometimes called erased, because they are neither marginalized nor privileged, so their challenges are not really are a different kind of struggle than if you're marginalized, and it's a different kind of privilege than if you're in the center. And I don't know if you have done the work of putting yourself into one of these, but what's highlighted in the literature is that it's emotionally challenging. And it is. I naively wrote a paper with a student who was arguing that we should do this more in the sciences. So we have developed a model, which right now we've parked because it became too challenging to actually finalize the paper. It's emotionally challenging to see yourself as more privileged than you would like to be, or less privileged than you would like to be. And there is quite a bit written about that. And the idea with this wheel is to use it as a help, a facilitated help, to think through the power and privileges, because we're not just one-dimensional people. We have several dimensions. And when intersectionality was first coined back in the 90s, by Crenshaw, it was mainly a question of white men of European descent and Black women of non-European descent, and the way the white men got overly privileged, and the way it's placed together with being both Black and woman and coming from a non-privileged country, how that really puts these people in very different places. 20 years later, we know that most of us, except for a few, can be both oppressed and oppressors. And we're constantly changing between these roles, depending on in which situation we are. Some of us are more privileged more often, others are less privileged or more marginalized more often. And it's used as help to guide conversations about these difficult issues. And it's often emphasized in these discussions that this is emotionally challenging. Be aware of that. There might be a lot of anger coming out in these conversations. Since it's increasingly recognized that it actually does matter who the researchers are. Well, yeah, I was going to say that these are mainly used to develop positionality statements for yourself as a way of reflecting on who you are and the research you do. And whether they should be published or not is a big debate, and because they can actually backfire, etc. But that's a different discussion. It could be a whole seminar in itself, so I won't go into that. But those are interested, I can share literature about it. Yeah, so should it be in the sciences? Should we do it in the sciences? And if we do it in the sciences, should we publish it, or should it just be a tool for reflection? So also Arga can be used as a tool for transparency to make it easier to see who are actually the research community composed of, who exists in that space. So the insight that the researcher matters isn't exactly new. Sandra Harding, back in the 80s, she developed standpoint theory, which in a very simplified manner means that where you're standing, you see things from a different perspective, and if you stand something else, and standing meaning who you are. She coined a couple of terms that I find quite useful: strong and weak objectivity. Whereas as a scientist, I'm taught to have procedural rigor, that is to report exactly which method I use and how I use them, etc., etc. And that, she argues, gives weak objectivity. It's necessary, but it's not sufficient. You also have to look at the research community, because if it's very homogeneous, there's a huge risk that it might actually cause damage rather than privilege some people, but cause damage to others. And the problem isn't that we all have different standpoints. The problem is that if we all have the same background, there becomes an echo chamber, because we think of the same things as relevant and interesting. And the things that we don't find interesting and relevant, we ignore. And that's natural that we ignore that. And as you know, for a long time, science has been dominated by white, European descendants, middle to upper class men. And in the late 19th and early 20th century, there was a number of theories that were born that were generally accepted, that assumed that men of European descent were more intelligent than others, and also more worthy. Was, for example, considered textbook knowledge that females shouldn't do math because then our uterus would shrink and it would impact our reproduction. There was, interestingly, not any empirical evidence for this, but it was still the truth. There's no mention about what it might happen to men if they were doing too much math. Less funny examples are the medical experiments that were done on non-white people, such as the Tuskegee studies in the US, where Black men with syphilis were left untreated because it was interesting to study how the disease would progress naturally. Another terrible example, more close to the bone here in Canada, is the systematic starvation of children in some Indigenous children in some of the residential schools to study how malnutrition impacts child development. It's hard to imagine that research groups that were consisting of Indigenous peoples, Black peoples, and women would have come up with these kind of theories and experiments. And today we shudder at these descriptions because they are in today's eyes highly unethical. But aside from these studies, there are also a number of other studies that come from the homogeneity of the research community. For example, was for the longest time, I think they've stopped doing it now, but that we use male white mice for a medical experiment because they have less variation than the male. They're white and they're male. Because if they're white, they have less variation. If they're female, if they're male, they have less variation than if they're females, because the hormones go up and down. But the results of that is that there's been a maltreatment of women and misdiagnosis of heart disease, for example. Unfortunately, we're not out of this yet. This book is a little bit depressing reading. I don't know if you're familiar with it. My husband read it and he cited some of the chapters. I read some of it, but I couldn't make myself read it all because it's just too much of stuff that's going on today that is directly discriminatory or making women invisible. And one of the examples is that the dummies used to test the impact of car crashes were until very recently based on the standard male European body, with very few car companies doing tests with female dummies. And then they started using female dummies maybe a decade ago, but always in the passenger seat. And the result, according to this book, well, in a car crash, women drivers are 47% more likely to be seriously injured than men, 71% more likely to be moderately injured, and 17% more likely to die. So I want to emphasize with these examples is that the belief that the context-independent objective science does not only risk producing biased or flawed studies, but it actually risks producing dangerous science. Research that is harmful to some, but brings benefits to others. And the belief that science delivers context-independent and objective knowledge hides that the desires and interests vary among individuals and societies, and that the questions that are deemed relevant, interesting, and worthwhile to explore reflect the desires, interests, and values of those in power. So, 30 years after Harding coined standpoint theory, we now have an increasing number of studies that, perhaps unsurprisingly, show what she was suggesting, that diverse research communities are less likely to conduct biased studies. And in addition, research conducted by diverse research teams is not only less biased than research conducted by homogeneous research teams, it also seems that they're more innovative. And the word better is, of course, very value-laden, but there is suggestions, an increasing number of studies, I would say, that suggest that diverse research communities also conduct better research in the sense that they're better at serving the interests of the whole society rather than just specific groups. In my abstract, I mentioned that this talk is inspired by Eve Tuck's 2009 paper Suspending Damage, a letter to communities. There she is. The paper is written as a comment to the dominating way of doing research about Indigenous peoples, typically conducted by outsiders who, without consent, extract data, information, and knowledge from Indigenous peoples, and then use the findings in ways that serve the interests of the researchers, not seldom harming those who provided the knowledge. In the early days, research focused on how backward, curious, or exotic these people were. And since the early 60s or so, research has mainly focused on how damaged they were. So do a quick search for stats on Indigenous peoples in Canada, and you will find out that they are more drug addicted, have more diabetes, they have higher alcohol rates, they have more domestic violence, higher levels of incarceration, etc. In short, they're damaged goods. And Canada, of course, needs to provide help. Canada, of course, needs to support these people so they can get better. This is what's called extractive and damage-centric research. The data that exists does not in any sense serve Indigenous peoples. it only makes them more vulnerable to oppression because it gives Canada the right to continue to oppress them because it needs Canada to care of them. So this is what also can be called helicopter science. You fly in, you do some stuff, and you move again, or colonial science, if you wish. Tuck argues for a shift from this damage-centered and extractive approach to a desire-based one. She calls for research that's driven by the interests, the desires, and needs of Indigenous peoples. Notably, the Indigenous peoples in Canada are not an oppressed minority among others. They have a legal right to self-determination and sovereignty, and they're not stakeholders, they're rights holders. And if Canada is to stand by its legally agreed responsibilities, it needs to support research that meets the needs of Indigenous peoples, their desires. A lot has happened, thankfully, since 2009, when Harding wrote Tuck wrote that paper. The number of Indigenous-led research groups, laboratories, and projects in Canada has increased considerably. Examples from the environmental field are the Civic Laboratory for Environmental Action Research, CLEAR, which is led by Professor Maxwell Poiron. They've written the book Pollution is Colonialism, for example. If you have anything to do with environmental contamination or plastic or pollution, it's a book well worth reading. Or the Indigenous Fisheries Center here at UBC, led by Professor Andrea Reid. Or the Technoscience Research Unit at U of T, led by Professor Murphy. To mention a few, there's 20 years, I arrived in Canada 18 years ago, and the number of Indigenous-led research projects, programs, etc., has increased dramatically during these years. There's also change happening more broadly, with an increasing number of people in academia and in governmental positions who are learning how to engage meaningfully and respectfully with Indigenous communities. This is increasingly important, not least because there are a number of legal changes that are happening that require governments to engage with Indigenous communities and Indigenous knowledge. How many know what Bill S5 is? Okay. So in June 2013, are you connected to the internet with your computer?
Yes.
Yeah, okay, good, then I can click on this. Well, since June 20, last June, June 13 last year, we have the right to health and environment in Canada, and under the Environmental Protection Act. And you can see here that the amendments to the CEPA, the Environmental Protection Act, confirm the government's commitment to implement the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, which will be implemented in consultation and cooperation with Indigenous peoples. And they sent out a discussion paper in January, and it's a 60-day comment period, and we will be meeting next week to craft a letter that we will encourage other people to sign, because there's a number of things. In many other countries, the right to health and environment sits under the Constitution. In Canada, they choose to put it under the Environmental Protection Act, which doesn't, there's 11 different acts that cover pollution or chemicals in different ways. And CEPA doesn't always override those other acts. So it's unclear how this is going to be implemented, and it's unclear how it's going to be enforced. And that's what they're asking about in this discussion paper. So if you have an interest in this, let me know, and I'll invite you to the meeting we have. I don't remember the time that we're having the meeting on Tuesday, or let me know if you want to have the draft that we're preparing so you can sort of revise in your own words and send to the government. But this is hugely important, and they're emphasizing that this needs to be with engagement with Indigenous peoples. Yeah. And this brings me then to the questions about OCAP. Are you familiar with OCAP principles? Yes? No? A few? Are you? Okay. So these principles have been developed by, So there's a 6-minute video that explains what OCAP is. And those are principles that are developed to help us conduct research with Indigenous peoples in a way that actually works and better help us understand what kind of data, how to handle data and how to handle research. And it talks about ownership and about control over the data, the access to the data, and the possession of the data, which is different about ownership. I won't go into the details here. It's a bit problematic. I don't know if they have changed the procedures yet, but if you do research with Indigenous communities and they own the data, UBC has been insisting that UBC owns the data. And we had one student who barely managed to get the right to defend her thesis because she wouldn't have the consent forms that gives UBC the right to the data and her as a researcher because the data belongs to the community. I think it has been changed. I hope it has been changed. Not sure. Let's see how do I go back to. But if you're interested and want to learn more about this, there's a quick course here as well that can be taken and to get a better understanding of these principles. Computer has got locked, so I have to go on my memory. In parallel, not in parallel, the OCA principles were established in the 90s. And as of 2020, I think the first paper was produced as a group from the University of Arizona under the lead of Stefan Rosa Carl that have developed what they call the CARE principles that take these principles one step further. And what they did was that they collected a group of people. They based the study on these principles from Indigenous peoples, but also about data, open data principles, etc. And then they had a workshop and then they extracted what kind of principles are guiding these guidelines. And they can see that some principles are data-oriented, other principles are people-oriented, and others are purpose-oriented. There we go. And if we look at, you're probably more familiar with either the FAIR principles, which is about they can be findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable, which is very data-oriented principles, or the open data charter principles, about open by default, timely, comprehensible, accessible, reusable, comparable, interoperable, and purpose-oriented for improved governance and citizen engagement, for user development, innovation, etc. If we then compare those with the 4 different Indigenous-led principles that have been developed, you can see a difference in color. So you can see that the principles over here are very data-oriented, whereas the principles over here are people-oriented. And what they did was to look at all these and say, okay, how can we create principles that actually considers both the data, the purpose, and the people? So they developed the CARE principles. And I don't know if you can see here, but the C is collective benefit for inclusive development and innovation, for improved governance and citizen engagement, and for equitable outcomes. They have authority to control, the recognizing rights and interests, data for governance. As I mentioned, very little of the data that is collected today is useful for Indigenous peoples to actually be able to guide for their self-determination, for their sovereignty. And who governs the data. So data for governance and the governance of the data, both of those. Responsibility for positive relationships, for expanding capability capacity, and for Indigenous languages and values. And finally, E, ethics, for minimizing harm, maximizing benefit, for justice and future use. Time, by the way. So let's just stop and see where are we now? What have I sort of been going through so far? Well, we were taught, at least I was taught, that science delivers objective, generalizable, context-independent knowledge. The individual researcher does not matter, should not matter. During the years since I was an undergrad, we've come to realize that the who, the where, the when do matter, because different people find different things interesting and will therefore ask different questions, and they will value different types of data. These differences in interest aren't random. They depend on our social context, and they consequently vary both the time and the place. We also come to realize that the belief that science delivers context-independent and objective knowledge hides that desires and interests vary among individuals and societies, and that the questions that are deemed relevant, interesting, and worthwhile to explore reflect the desires, the interests, and values of those in power. All these research groups that in the literature on indigenous knowledge, etc., which is a quite growing, very interesting literature, we are consistently told that we need to decolonize science. What on earth does that mean? We've just done a study together with some people from a governmental organization, and that was one of the first questions. And what do you mean by that our system is colonial? I mean, Canada is no longer a colony. And what does that mean? And I will not explain that in detail because I can't. But what is quite clear is similar to a fish in water. It's really, really challenging for anybody. I just see that one of my slides disappeared. To see the system we're in. So when we talk about other ways of knowing, we wonder what might that be? Because we can't see that we have a way of knowing, that we are in a system that values certain things, that we use certain language, certain words to describe the things around us. And before we can see our own way, we can't engage with other ways of knowing. And there is an increasing number of papers and studies. And yesterday I subscribed to National Academies of Sciences sent list and the limits of data by Tine Doyen. I got in my inbox yesterday, which talks about that data and the way we do science, focusing on quantification and the fact that data decontextualizes knowledge and information, makes us lose a lot of information and a lot of important factors. And in this very interesting, not too long read, he talks about how this impacts our way of value and how it supports things that can be quantified and does not support things that can't be quantified. And that when we talk about decolonizing science, it's also going back and thinking about when Canada was colonized. All settlers weren't in power. There were certain people that were in power. And the way that the systems were set up, the way we collected data, etc., served the interests of those in power and privilege. And what he is pointing out in his paper, and funnily enough, I got an email from a friend who said, have you seen this paper by Esther Turnhout, who is a professor in the Netherlands, also pointing out that the way we do research serves those in privilege and power in today's society. And it makes those privileged and powerful more privileged and powerful. So what these two, and hers is more radical than his paper, but I recommend reading both. But they both point to that we need to think more about what kind of research are we doing? How does the scientific enterprise support the power structures that we have today? And I was listening to the news the other day, and they were claiming that in the US, I think it's the same in Canada, the richest have gotten richer considerably richer in the past decade, whereas the rest of us have gotten poorer. And the richer is the ultra rich. And what these people claim is that we're supporting that through our research. The way the academic system works. And because we're not asking ourselves how our research actually fits into the bigger picture and how our way of thinking fits into it. And I'm working with chemicals management and how to include indigenous knowledge into chemicals management. I'm working with a group of indigenous professors. And this paper by Evan Hepper-Smith talks about how we think about chemicals and what they are. And in the 50s, there was a push to start categorizing human-made chemicals for trade reasons. You needed to know what it was when you were trying to sell it to someone else. And there was a need for alignment across countries that were producing chemicals. We had a revolution of man-made chemicals that were for plastics and fertilizers and pesticides, etc. So they came up with what's called the CAS system today, which is a database held in the US. And that was a way of categorizing chemicals. In the 60s and the 70s, we started to develop regulation for chemicals. So how would you be allowed to sell this thing? Is it just too dangerous to sell, or is it actually poisonous for the environment, etc.? And the regulation is built around the same system. So the CAS system and the way of diagnosing what's the problem is the focus is on the chemicals as an individual specific. And this way of thinking is today so natural, so we can't think without it. What he argues is that prior to the CAS system, somewhere around before 1900 something, the way chemists were thinking about chemistry was processes. It was constant things changing. And how are things changing? And what makes things change? There was a constant understanding of the processes that are happening. Where the individual chemicals, didn't really play a major role because they changed so quickly. And we know you take a pill, you know exactly which substance is in that pill. Maybe not because it has some plastic on it, maybe, or whatever. But we know the active substance exactly. We stick it in our mouth and it starts changing because of physical, biological, and chemical processes in our mouth, in our gut. There's bacteria that are working on it, things are changing, and they become more or less active. It comes out either by breathing my hair or in the toilet, it goes in the sewage treatment plant, it continues to change. And when we do tox testing, we still do that specific substance alone with a specific organism alone, and we test it that way. And that way of thinking is very mechanistic. And this has been criticized for quite some time, talking about how can we actually change this way of thinking about chemicals to make it more functional. Which, if you look at the way that many indigenous peoples think about how chemicals work or what chemicals are, it's much more process-oriented. So that ties back to the way we were thinking before the CAS system. So what he's arguing is by going back and looking at how do we think about nature? How do we think about our role in nature? How do we think about relationships? And that relations are central. And how can we change our way of thinking about chemicals in a way so it becomes more productive or more aligned with how this nature actually works and how the systems actually work. So the argument there is that we can actually learn something from the indigenous ways of knowing, and it can help us by learning how they are thinking. We can suddenly see how we are thinking and how that might be problematic, how our way of naming things. So Chiplo at the University of Guelph has done quite a bit of research together with Paul Maiden and some others about the role of language. And apparently, many of the indigenous languages in Canada aren't noun-driven the way that English is. They're verb-driven, which focuses on the processes, focuses on relationships, and it gives you a different way of thinking. So Deborah McGregor, she's written a paper, she's written a number of really good papers, but one of them is about the difficulty of seeing. It's about people in community government and the difficulty for them to see outside their own world. And when they talk about other ways of knowing or indigenous ways of knowing, it ends, she argues that it often ends up in, okay, where is your data? How can we stick it in our system? And that it becomes reduced to all engagement with indigenous people is reduced to in the end, give us your data and stick it in the system. Because the existing system is not seen as a system. It's not seen as a way that is structured by a certain way of thinking. So to end up, I'm fairly almost at 15, okay. What we need to start asking ourselves and what we can learn, and what I want to emphasize is that we can learn, I think we have a lot to learn from other ways of knowing. I'm not saying that we should run up to all our indigenous colleagues or students and ask them to teach us. That would be awful. They have enough on their plate for that. But there's lots of good writings, lots of good books and texts on these topics to sort of see in what way does their way of knowing differ from ours, and how can that help us see how our way of doing things might be problematic, and whose interest is the scientific enterprise actually serving, who's benefiting and who might be harmed. And I'm not answering the question of my talk, I'm ending by putting it out to you. So if we're talking about then using Eve Tuck's paper and saying we want to do desire-based research, we can't all work with indigenous communities. We can be allies and we can see how we might be harming. And as both Maxwell Baron and others have pointed out, at times you should not be the one doing the research. You should just step away and not be the problem. If you have knowledge that a community wishes to use, of course, and you need to be done even more than those who don't. But if you're not engaging with indigenous communities or serving indigenous communities, which majority won't be doing, then we should be asking ourselves, so what does a desire-based research look like in a diverse research community? Assuming that we actually will be working and seeing diverse research communities as something good. So what does diversity mean? What kind of diversity do we need to be able to actually identify the research that we do that might be harmful to someone? Who are those groups that might be harmed? Who are those people? What kind of environment? Which kind of people do we need in the room? So it's a question of diversity, both when it comes to disciplines, when it comes to cultural backgrounds, when it comes to language backgrounds, etc. And so whose desires and how do we better serve societies? Thank you.
Thank you so much. That was very interesting talk. I don't know, we have about 5 or 10 minutes for questions. If anyone had any questions for our speaker, either online on Zoom.
And I'm a little bit hard of hearing, so you have to speak up. I have a microphone sitting in the middle of the room, so I should be able to.
It looks like Jim on Zoom has a question. So Jim, feel free to unmute and ask your question.
Yeah, thank you. Just wanted to say it was an absolutely fascinating talk, and I certainly appreciated all the references and so on, and this body of knowledge that you were describing. I did want to mention in this context that Karl Popper had an alternative to what we call objective science, and it was called intersubjective. And so he recognized that objectivity was sort of a myth or an illusion. And we did actually embrace that in some work I did a long time back in this intersubjectivity. And within that context, you could actually prove theorems about stuff. And because it allowed for a variety of utility functions, which of course incorporate desire or other things like that, you could actually formalize design of experiments and so on. It wasn't exactly a popular subject because the statisticians, of course, are pretty hung up on their standard methods. but it did produce some fairly fascinating theorems. One of them was called the ignorance of bliss theorem, which showed that if you had a group of people with diverse opinions on how to gather or about a subject, the optimal strategy was not to get any data, because if people were just allowed to go ahead without data, they might do better than in a utility function set than if they got data and were proved wrong, however that data were collected. But it would allow, I think, in principle, desire-based models for setting up experiments. So I guess when I get some time, I'll try to look into that a little bit. But thank you for introducing us to these ideas, or at least me, and appreciated the talk.
Thank you. I'm looking backwards because I can't see you here, so.
Oh, yeah.
But thank you for the comment. Do you have any other questions or comments? Yeah.
Yeah, I think going back actually to sort of maybe one of the things you mentioned more in the beginning with, I'm totally blanking on the term right now, like statements that you add for positionality statements. Yeah. And I think also I think there's like so much of the scientific infrastructure we have built up right now is going on the basis of like objectivity. And like I'm thinking right now, especially around like things like double blind reviewing or like those sorts of processes, which I feel like are so central to sort of the mechanisms that we have to propagate science now. And I guess maybe I'm mostly interested in like thinking about a lot of the things that you talked about, sort of like, do you imagine that there would need to be like, we would have to say like totally redo like systems like double blind reviewing, or that is there sort of a way for like a graceful propagation of a lot of these ideas that you presented?
Well, it's a very hard question. The work that we're doing right now asks, do we need to overhaul the whole system? Can we actually chip at it? I come from a socialist country, not the communist country. And as far as I know, attempts to revolutions rarely work. To ripping up a system from the ground and rebuilding from start, I don't think it will happen. And I think I'm hoping that it's possible to chip away and sort of find things that can be changed and change it from inside. There's a number that argue that we can't do that. It has to be changed from totally. So I'm hoping. I think we can change it from the inside and bring it about. When just the changes are happening right now in an increased awareness that data actually isn't objective. It is context dependent. It can be objective, but not context dependent, but context dependent. And that 20 years ago, you would almost be lynched if you said that. Whereas today you have fewer people going, well, no, data has to be totally separated from values. Science should be totally objective, sitting there and doing it outside and coming up and then delivering the information to policymakers. Whereas an increasing awareness that, well, we're all driven by values, so we better just put them on the table to make sure that the right values are actually driving that discussion. So I'm hopeful.
And I guess actually as a follow-up question, I think that now in society, I feel like there is, growing distrust in science. And I think that I could imagine that like with a push for more desire-based research, that could fuel a lot of, say like conspiratorial mindsets around science. And I'm wondering thinking about positioning desire-based research and especially how it's communicated to the larger populace, like how to combat then maybe pushback from the larger community that might think that now science is even more so serving special interests.
Yeah, it's actually, leave that one on. That's good. Thank you. I'm hard of hearing, so I have a microphone sitting in the middle of the room. Well, there's been a lot of arguments, and the so-called paper, I don't know if you're familiar with that, that sort of was was a physicist who wrote a Bologna paper in the language of science and technology studies, got it published, and then revealed that it was a fake. And it's a long and complicated story, but he did it to show that the left-wing movement in the humanities, who was striving to show the context dependent of science, that where Harding and others belonged to, was going to hurt science. And it was just crap, excuse my language. If you look into what has happened, that's not really the case. And there's an argument that says that the way we teach science is actually the problem. By teaching science as if it is a deliverable of irrefutable facts, we get people to have an over expectation of science that it can deliver all these things. And when we get things like Corona happening, in the beginning, everybody knows we don't know anything. But very quickly, scientists are expected to deliver the truth. And when the scientists disagree, then you lose trust in science because they were told that you should be able to trust it. So the fact that we should teach, and Will and I have been involved in Science 113, teach that science is context dependent. And we have to work with that. It's an extremely strong tool, but you have to recognize its limitations and that it can't be applied to everything. And the fact that scientists disagree, that's part of science. It's part of what we're doing. We disagree, that's our business. And if that is not known more widely, then you lose trust in science. It's not, so I would argue it's the other way around.
Okay, well, let's thank your speaker again.